and today I'm going to tell you about Phillis Wheatley. Phillis Wheatley was an African slave born in supposedly Gambia in the year 1753. She was eventually kidnapped from her home in the year 1761 and was brought to America, where the Wheatley family purchased her at an auction in Massachusetts. Wheatley took the last name of her master, which was the custom at the time. According to the National Women's History Museum biography of Phillis Wheatley, she was named after the ship that brought her to America, the Phillis. Phillis Wheatley did not do ordinary housework, and instead she was responsible for dusting or other light work. Mrs. Wheatley did not permit Phillis to mingle with the other slaves, thus removing her from her fellow African Americans and isolating her from her heritage. The Wheatley family educated Phillis in Greek and Latin classics, British literature, and the Bible. In 1767, she published her first poem. Her second poem, an Ilic poem on the death of the celebrated divine George Whitefield in 1770, increased her fame. The Wheatley's son brought Phillis to England to publish her first collection of poems titled Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. This book made Phillis Wheatley the first published African author and the second woman author to publish a book in America. The book included an image of Phillis Wheatley as well as a foreword written and signed by John Hancock. The article, The Privileged and Impoverished Life of Phillis Wheatley, published by the JSTOR Daily and written by Shannon Lutters Manuel, described Phillis Wheatley as a child prodigy who is the only representative black woman generally recorded as a product of the Revolutionary period. Lutters Manuel also explored the idea that Wheatley's poems were race neutral, which added to her widespread appeal and significance during the Revolution. The History Museum credited Wheatley's life as a major influence on her poetry, including her African heritage. Along with her heritage, religion greatly influenced her poetry and was used by many to further their own cause. For example, some slave owners used her work to convince slaves to convert to a different religion, while abolitionists used her poetry as proof of the intellectual abilities of people of color. Phillis Wheatley was significant because she demonstrated to the public that African Americans were equally capable, creative, and intelligent human beings, who would also benefit from an education, when many only viewed them as slaves. Wheatley was credited often with the start of the abolition movement. Wheatley was also a controversial figure in the black community because she did keep her poems particularly race neutral. Recently, scholars have argued that her race neutral poetry was ingrained from her masters as well as necessary for her own survival. According to Lutters Manuel, Wheatley's poetry could be used to speak directly with her fellow slaves because they had a second meaning. The scholars then began to study the relationship between Phillis Wheatley and her fellow African Americans. The article, Phillis Wheatley, A Black Perspective, published in the Journal of Negro Education, described Wheatley as someone who was taught by whites to think white. Therefore, Wheatley's significant poetry cannot be attributed to the African American community, since according to the article, she was not sensitive enough to the needs of her own people to demonstrate a kinship to blacks in her life or writings. Wheatley's isolation from her fellow slaves and her assimilation into the white world of the 1770s was significant because she was not able to understand her position as a slave fully. The author of Phillis Wheatley, A Black Perspective, explained that although the publication of her poetry book was significant to the advancement of the general historical contributions of the African American community in America, when you think of her as a specific historical figure, she's lacking for the black perspective. Poetry was significant. She was influential in spreading the word of African American communities. She worked to help the abolition cause in terms of encouraging African American education in America at the time. However, like Betsy Ross, she has more to her story than just poetry. Depending on your viewpoint of Phillis Wheatley, you can see her poetry as advancing the African American community, or you can see her as an author of race-neutral poetry that was working to support what her master believed in. Wheatley and Ross are both women who are remembered for great things. However, it's sometimes difficult to remove the women from the myth that surrounds them. When you are looking at a historical figure, particularly during the time of the American Revolution, you have to take into account all the aspects of the world around them and who they are as a person in order to create a well-rounded biography. Phillis Wheatley is significant. Her poetry is significant to the cause of the revolution. It's just imperative that we look at all pieces of the puzzle when determining who she is or who she was.